interesting shader aesthetic to the entire, like to all of the games in terms of the visuals. Like when you see a Borderland game, you know that that's part of the series. Is there like an equivalent for the sound part? Meaning like some kind of a cohesive thing that like when you hear this, it doesn't even matter if the style is different. You're like, oh yeah, that's the sound for Borderlands.
And in my opinion, I'm not really sure. It's something that's actually hard to pin down because even in the previous titles, they had anywhere between like four and maybe five different composers composing those tracks. Jesper Kid did some stuff. Um, Finishing Move did some stuff. Some of the folks that were on the internal team did some stuff. So you have these different composers with, of course, different styles trying to give their taste of what Borderlands might be. Because as you know, Borderlands is kind of like it's a mixed bag of stuff. It's not just one thing. So it's very difficult to, how would you say, like define what it is exactly, you know?
Did you get to talk to those other composers that worked on the previous games?
No, no, I didn't. No, no. I was a brand new in-house composer, and my assignment was to work on this music for Wonderlands, and that's what I did. I worked with the internal team, the associate music director, and we came up with a plan of what we were thinking music should sound like. Um, so yeah.
This kind of brings me to the next question. You told me before that you started as a contractor and then later on you became an in-house composer. Can you talk a little bit about the difference from just working on a project as a freelancer or as a contractor and being a full house, like in-house, sorry, composer?
For sure. I mean, I'm not exactly sure, but I do know that when dev companies outsource, composers to do some music, they generally go between 3 and maybe 4 months. And I believe that at the time, Gearbox was looking for an in-house composer to have on their staff. And so I think that was sort of my tryout, if you will,
Mhm.
to contract with me for a little bit and to see if it was working out and if it was a good fit. And fortunately, that worked out, you know. So
Yeah, I know a lot of stories of composers and sound designers that started as a contractor and then the contract just never ended and they turn into an in-house composer.
yeah,
What do you feel is better for musicians? Like, how would you enter into the industry, and what would be your advice for someone who is looking to get in?
yeah, I get that question a lot. I think, and the good news is that it's, well, good and bad news. It's one of the hardest things you can ever do as an artist is find your own voice. You can sort of,
That is so true.
I mean, you can strive to be what you think people want you to sound like, like covering your bases. Like I can make, orchestral film music, or I can make commercial music. I can make, avant-garde music. I can make all different kinds of music. I make pop music. That is really great to have under your belt as far as, these are the palettes that I can do, right? Um, but I think ultimately what got my position there was that I didn't necessarily sound like everyone else on the market, because I work a lot in the experimental music arts. I work a lot on, music that if you folks heard, you wouldn't think that this fits into, video game music at all. But that very process of composing like that is kind of what helped me to think in this new way, which in game music, of course, it has to be a modular system. It's not linear. It sounds linear, but how do you create, a music score that is interactive, right? And so I think that was another part of what helped me get in was understanding that sort of side of music.
So from someone who is, let's say, is a musician and have practiced for many years in a row, how do you find your unique voice? Like what steps can you take to find that?
Yeah, I mean, really, you have to do your crazy ideas, if that makes sense. You have to, you have to make music for yourself or sound design for yourself, whatever it is you're making, without really the thought of, I'm only going to make this because someone can use it for this thing or this, this score. At least that's what I found for myself. Most of the craziest pieces that I composed, for myself, I never thought they would ever be played, ever, I mean, it's not that often that you can have a piece for 3 grand pianos played because first of all, it's hard to get all those instruments in a space, right? So you're, you know, you're not very likely to have those sorts of performances, but somehow, those pieces that I wrote were able to be performed because there happened to be an opportunity for that. I wrote a piece for 12 cellos once, thinking the
Oh
same
wow.
thing, like, no one's ever going to play this, because when am I ever going to have 12 celli in the room, you know? But sure
Well,
enough, it happened.
if you have links, please put this in our server, the Sonic Sphere, so other people can listen to it too, because it sounds super
Sure,
interesting. You don't have to do it now; we can do it later.
sure,
But yeah, I love that advice. I had someone once told me, try to write something that is crap, like just a bad piece, because we're so trained to like write something that everyone would find good that like just alleviate yourself from trying to make it good and just make something for the heck of doing it.
sure, yeah,
I truly believe that this is part of the practice of becoming better sound designers, which is what this channel is all about.
absolutely.
Um, how about, can you talk to us about some of the exploration that you did to find that unique sound for Tiny Tina's Wonderlands?
Yeah, well, that's a good question because this was actually my first score for a game. And so
Oh, wow.
a lot of this
That's a
was,
huge title. Yeah,
yeah, I know. I'm very, very fortunate. Does not mean that I didn't work extremely hard to get where I'm at. So, um,
I bet.
but it was my first, title, and um, I'm finding that, I think that really it's a different process every time, but I think that really it comes into defining what the actual like pillars are that you want to achieve in the game. It almost has nothing to do with the aesthetic. You know what I mean? Um,
Oh, wow.
and thinking about how the music is going to be implemented and how it's going to be interactive. These are things that I'm finding that are almost, I mean, they're kind of more important in the beginning because we're composers. We can sit
Really?
down and write. We can sit down. We can write music. We know we can pump out music that is going to sound like we kind of have an idea for. But how the game is actually going to perform that music is a different thing. And so there's a lot of collaboration with, the technical designers and, the audio director and the music director on how all these music systems are going to work. And, you know, so of course, that's not really an answer, but when you devise um, a style guide, when you say like, I want Tiny Tina's Wonderlands to sound like okay, it's a magic kind of orchestral sound. Do I want it to sound like Lord of the Rings or do I want it to sound like Harry Potter? Now, those are two very different sounds, right? But they're like kind of a
Right.
similar aesthetic, right? But you know that those are like, okay, those are vastly different, you know? And so those are kind of the things you think of as pillars. Like, okay, we want this game to sound like Harry Potter, but we don't want it to sound like Lord of the Rings. Um, so
I was
that's
about to ask, when you bring those ideas to a larger team that is not necessarily musicians, because you probably work with visual artists and with programmers, how do you convey your ideas? Because I'm finding it very hard to explain people who are not audio people how to think about something that for them is invisible, because they're so used to visual art.
sure. I mean, really all of this information kind of stays within the audio team. Um, if anybody is
Okay.
gonna yeah, if anybody is going to really talk, I think to, visual designers, it's usually like the lead or like the audio director. But we're all audio folks. We kind of are trusted to do our audio things, and it doesn't mean there isn't feedback from, say, the creative director of the game. Like, well, I like what you guys did, but I kind of think it should be more like this, you know. Um, so
So most
we
of
don't.
your interactions is with a team of audio folks.
Yeah,
So can
yeah,
you talk a little bit about your team, the size of the team? Who do you have there? What's the kind of workload that you have?
sure. We let's see. We have like I don't know exact numbers, but we have a grip of sound designers, technical sound designers, which are people that focus more on how things are actually going to be implemented. We have an associate music director. We have myself as an in-house composer. We have a VO team, all the people that work on VO. Um, yeah, and there's basically leads for each of those departments, and they kind of lead their branch of the team, and all those leads kind of get together and strategize how that's going to work.
And when you deliver your work, how does that look? Do you give them WAV files? Do you give them a WISE project? Like, how does the transferring of things into ideally the game eventually?
Yeah, it depends. I think that if you're a contractor, for instance, you're not as deep into the game as someone who actually works on the team because you're only there for a certain amount of time, right? So I think most of the time, those folks that are contracting aren't thinking about implementation, so they're not working in WISE or FMOD generally. Um, but when you get to work inside the team, it's really special because you're closer to the project, so you are able to have your fingers in WISE and like so for Wonderlands, I delivered my assets in STEM form, and I
Mhm.
was learning how to implement those into WISE with other folks who are helping me with that. And that's kind of how I delivered it. And it always goes through a feedback system. Like you don't just throw stuff in there and like, okay, we're done. Like, it's a collaborative effort.
Yeah, don't toss assets over the fence and just assume that someone will know what to do with them.
Yeah.
For people who are just starting, what would you recommend for them to learn in terms of like abilities that would help them integrate their sounds better?
Yeah, I
Because you
think
said you had to learn on the go, so
yeah, I think that if you don't know anything about sound implementation, like with Wise or Fmod, I think that that's a really great thing to do. Wise, WISE also has free lessons, like they have a Wise 101, 202, that you
mhm.
can go through for free and take for free. You can get certified. Like that's a really good resource for people.
Yeah, we would post those resources later after this call. So why would you recommend Wise and not Fmod or Elias, or there are many different middlewares?
I wouldn't
Or is
recognize.
just yeah.
I wouldn't recommend one over the other. They both can do similar things. So learn both though.
Yeah, you would learn both.
Yeah. The more
And
skills you have, the easier, like the more people are gonna want you to work with them.
I was about to ask if you have any advice for other skills that you saw that were useful beyond the basic skills of, learning music and sound design, that might help people.
Yeah, I mean, understanding orchestration, but understanding production, how to actually mix an album, that's a really great thing. Yeah.
So you had to mix yours?
I mean, I think generally all the sound designers have a knowledge of mixing and they mix their albums or not albums, but their sounds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it different to mix for a video game where you have things from like a point source in the scene and like the mix is going to change over time as characters are moving, as opposed to like, let's say, a song on Spotify or even a film?
Yeah, for sure. That is something that the technical sound designers really focus on a lot, is how that's going to work. Yeah.
Tell me, please, one of the biggest challenges that you had when working on that game and how you solved it.
Yeah. I think I think that the biggest challenge is really to like keep yourself on course, but to trust your process and to trust like the vision that you have with your team, because it's easy to want to do things like differently, throughout the path. But as long as you stay consistent, you're kind of staying consistent with, the style guides that you wrote in the beginning, right? So, like a
Can you
funny
give us an
example,
example of
yeah,
how those, yeah. Mhm.
yeah. Like, so let's say we started like, okay, we're gonna write a Harry Potter score, right? Day one, and then by week nine, you're writing like, Aphex Twin EDM or IDM, and you're like, okay, we've obviously strayed off course. It's actually very easy to do that, because you do change a little bit in between in that path. So I think that that's a challenge, is to stay consistent. Um, Plus, you're not actually, sometimes you're not able to be consistent because things have to change, you know. So sometimes a course does take a change and you might have to go in a different direction. So I think that that's the biggest challenge.
Do you have an example for, let's say, a technical challenge that made you change the music because of that technical constraint?
Sure. I mean, a simple one you could think of is voice count. So sometimes as composers, we want to make things like, you know, full, like full. We want to hear like everything. We want to hear all the violins. We want to hear all like, all the basses, all the cello, all the violas. We want to hear like three marimbas. We want to hear like five suspended cymbals. Like we want to hear everything, but um, so voice count alone, you can't really have all that, and also technically in the mix, that doesn't work either because all you're thinking about is the music, but little do you know or are thinking of is that there's all kinds of guns happening, there's VO happening, there's technical things that you have to be aware of, if that makes sense. So that
Yeah,
was
there's
also,
always a battle between like who you get to hear, like the sound designers, the voiceover, or the music, and they
yeah,
constantly compete over like um the audience ears.
for sure. But it's similar to film. I mean, if there's an important thing happening in the film within the narrative and it's a line that's being delivered, obviously everyone should agree that that line should be the most present in the mix, right? That line isn't going to be, inaudible while the strings are playing over it, right? So, and I'm sure even the composer will agree with that. So, there is somewhat of a hierarchy of things that are most important at that any given time, right?
I think it's also a matter of ego with people because like people that have a lot of ego, like they would want their sound to be heard everywhere all the time, but then you're like, no, you have to like tone it down and actually fit it into the situation. Can you talk a
Okay.
little bit about the hierarchy of working on like on a shooter, basically? Like what
Mhm.
sounds are more important? What are you gonna hear?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, if you think about, playing a first person shooter, the thing that you're depending on which game it is too, because, what's that game? I can't remember which version of Call of Duty it is, but I mean, there's a lot of parts of that game where you're just running around and you're not really shooting very much, right? But in a game like, Wonderlands or, the Borderlands series, like you're shooting all the time. So, the gun sounds are kind of the highest priority. Like that's what you're naturally going to hear, so they are the highest priority, right? Now, music does play in between there. That's got to be designed very carefully so that um, not only it pokes through, but it doesn't get in the way or vice versa of each other, you know? And what if VO comes in? Like all these sort of things can happen and they do happen. So it's, I would say it's also a modular system where things have different priorities at different times. Sometimes the VO is more important, sometimes the gun sound design, sometimes the music, you know?
And how would you manage all of them when you have a game? Like, are you using side chaining? Is this a matter of like priority within Wise? Like, how would you set up that
Yeah, I
system?
mean, that's really in the mix hierarchy, and you can obviously automate those things in Wise. So I didn't have anything to do with that. That was really like the audio director and the associate audio director. And you know, some of the leads are in on that too, to really figure out how that's going to work. That's a very complex. Um, I don't want to say problem, but that's a very complex
Challenge.
challenge. Yeah. If you watched the God of War talk recently about how those sound designers mixed that game, I mean, I highly recommend watching that because they show you exactly what I'm talking about. They show you a live mixing board of seeing like the music go up and go down when VO comes in, and even down to like tricking you with thinking that there's more sound design in there than there actually is. You know, like if you're fighting, let's say, six enemies, okay, um, they figured out a way to be like, well, that sixth enemy is really far away from us, so we might not need to have them in the mix, you know, and let's see what happens when we do that. So there was this very subtractive mixing process, which made that game extremely clean. Um,
I think I saw like a lecture that they gave about Cyberpunk where they did kind of the same
yeah.
system. I haven't seen the God of War one, but again, we're going to be posting this after this talk so everyone else can enjoy that as well. Did you have to change the music based on this? Like avoid specific scales or I don't know, like change your composition because you knew that there are going to be like some gunshots in the same time?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a good thing to think about with Wonderlands, you know, for instance, and as everyone knows, there's like not infinite, but there's basically an infinite amount of guns, right? So there's an infinite amount of different pitches and tones that
And there are
you're
also magic spells in this one, right? There's
yeah,
guns and magic spells in the same time, I believe.
yeah. Yeah, I'm always thinking about where like my tonal centers lie in the overall mix. I'm thinking about how they lie with the Foley, you know? Like in the ambient music, especially, like if you have an ambient music piece happening, generally it's a pad of pretty music, you know? Um, but let's say that's in C, okay? But if you listen to the Foley and you listen to the wind and you actually listen to it and you think, "Oh, the Foley is in D." You know, not that they're thinking of it in D, but the fundamental of that pitch is closer to D. So you might, unconsciously hear those dissonances, right? So those are some creative things to think about when you're designing that way. Combat is a different beast altogether, but that's kind of what I'm thinking.
Can you talk a little bit more about combats and how do you tackle that issue?
Yeah, that's that is one that I think that every designer will figure out in their own way. But what I do find through my research and development of playing a lot of these games, when trying to design combat music, for Wonderlands and whatnot, is to see really what they're actually doing, and it's much thinner than you realize. It's not as thick and as intense as you realize because that gets in the way of the mix. So a challenge would be, how do you make really engaging, really moving music in a combat scene without getting in the way, right? It's a challenge because the more intense we want to make music, we generally tend to make it thicker and or louder, you know. Um, so
Games of
that is
even doing the opposite, that like if you were in a battle scene for too long, they would remove the music to make it easier for the player to go through the level.
sure, and they do that in Call of Duty like all the time. I mean, and they even did
Yeah.
it in Cyberpunk when I was doing some work on not work on that, but research and playing those games and seeing what they actually did. And and these were all things I found. They tuned the ambient music to the Foley. They, the more intense the combat got, the more instruments they took out. They were thinking very methodically about how that works. And that's why it's effective.
So what was your technique to creating a battle scene? I mean, of
Mm.
course, everyone's going to have their own idea, but how would you tackle that?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think in contrasts. So how drastically does this contrast from the ambient music? Because I already know that, okay, I have to be careful with my orchestration. I have to be careful with, I can't have, let's say there's a bunch of gunshots happening. I can't use a bunch of snare drums, right? Because it's in the same part of the spectrum. Like you're either going to hear it or not hear it, or it's going to get in the way, right? So I tend to try to design the music around the general area of what's happening in the spectrum, right? Um, and
Mhm.
also, like I said, in contrast, to try to see if I can make a drastic contrast from ambient to combat so that no matter what's happening in the game, it still gives the player like, oh, something's happening.
That's super interesting. Now, so nowadays you work as a in-house composer at Gearbox, correct?
Yes.
If you had to hire more people, what would you look for, or what should people prepare in their portfolio to get hired to a similar job or a different job on your team?
Yeah. I mean, like I said before, I think that versatile, I'll just call us artists, versatile artists are, I think, extremely valuable in the mainstream development world because, look, like these are corporations. They can hire what you called hired guns. You can hire the person that sounds like Hans Zimmer. You can hire the person that sounds like Danny Elfman. Like you can hire people for certain sounds. But what is hard to come by is someone who has knowledge of all these different sorts of things. Now that's just creatively. The other part is technically. So you're even more valuable to the team if you know what they're doing inside the engine, right? So that's why I say, like, telling anyone that learning some technical skills would definitely be, huge plus. I mean, getting in Unreal or Unity, whatever you're, using is super valuable, and teams like really value that because they don't have to figure out how to implement your work. you know like you can just be responsible for it or even innovate on it because you're thinking the same way they are and you're trying to figure out these problems at the same time you know
That is very true. I noticed as well that the second that I started coding, immediately it opened so many doors. And it's so much easier to work with people that can implement their own sounds. So, again, if someone is submitting a portfolio to you, what would you look for? Like,
yeah
what would you see if you would click on something? Um, we had questions about like how long should a demo reel be?
yeah that's a good question. That's also like it's not really definable. Like something i something I came to a realization of was, okay, like how I do a lot of things, so how do I represent that in a portfolio, right? So I have like a 3-minute reel, and in that reel is like some of the best projects I've worked on right in the beginning. A couple of seconds here, a couple of seconds here, a couple seconds here, but it covers all the bases. So it covers like, oh, here's the main menu, like, oh, and here's the music that I made in game, and then oh, here's the ambient music, and oh, here's a game music I did for an indie project, and then oh, here this whole section now is snapshots of Wise, how like I put things into Wise, and to show that you can do
You
that.
physically recorded your
Yeah,
screen with Wise?
yeah, you can do stuff like that. Like really just not being afraid to show everything you can do in the smallest amount of time possible is a good one. Now, people they're either going to want to see more than that or they're going to want to see less, but I figured I'll put my reel, you know, on a web page so that I can put other stuff on there too if they want to look at it, like a playlist of, oh, this is my other music that I make that is weird and like played by chamber groups and orchestras, and these are a few examples of my notation and scores, and it's impossible to put all that stuff in a 3-minute video, right? Like, um, so I think showing the creative and the technical in a reel is pretty good. It's pretty spot on. That's what most people want to see, I think.
I think that a lot of people are afraid of putting things that, let's say, not game audio related, like indie music that they made or like a concert for a quartet that they composed. And they're too afraid to put it down because they're afraid that people would see it and think that, oh, they're not the right material or,
Yeah.
it would harm their way of getting a job. What do you think about that?
I mean, I my advice for that is, do you want to be hired for who you are, or do you want to be hired for someone you're not pretending to be, but sort of trying to fit a role, you know? Um, I think that ultimately, and it depends on, the artist, but generally you want to be hired for what you're good at and what you want to do and what you like to do. Otherwise, you're just kind of copycatting, and then you kind of have to do that to continue to do the job. You know what I mean? Um,
Yeah, that's true.
you
A lot
you
of
see
people
this,
get stuck with that.
yeah, and like this is a tangent, but you see this on Instagram a lot. You see people who become, let's say, viral or famous for a certain thing, right? Maybe it's a dumb dance, or maybe it's a whatever, but they then become a slave to like having to do that role. It's and it like some of the actors in Seinfeld, right? A lot of them are like, man, I can't do anything now because I'll always be George, you know? So it's not a good or a bad thing, but my advice is to get hired because you're being you, not because you're being something else, you know? Um,
That is beautiful.
yeah. And I think you're more likely to get into the industry by standing out, Like if you're really great at writing indie music, like indie rock, I mean, that's definitely valuable. It's hard to produce that stuff well, and not every composer can do that. And if you're good at that, you should show that.
That is 100% true. I highly agree with this, and I feel like a lot of people have skills and abilities that they just don't appreciate because they think it's obvious or other people are not doing this. But there should be a balance between like going too rogue and, and not being able to integrate into big companies and like finding your own unique voice.
Of
So,
course.
where do you feel like you need to fit in?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like I said in the reel, there's basically two parts. There's the creative and then there's the technical. So you want to show these people that, yeah, this is my voice, but look, I can cover all these bases. You know what I mean?
Right.
So that balance you're talking about, that's definitely important. Um,
So,
yeah,
in
I mean,
terms of skills and stuff, yeah, go for it.
I was just gonna say, like, my advice for that is also to do. We have the internet. We can research so many things. We have so much at our fingertips. I mean, you can go watch 100 reels right now by people that you don't know and see what they did and get ideas from it. And also probably be inspired, like, oh, I thought of doing that and I was kind of afraid. Now I feel confident that I should do that. Um, the internet is your friend. It's used for a lot of bad things, but it can be used for a lot of great things.
Yeah. So you talked about versatility and knowing the technical side. So in terms of like really raw abilities that sound designers and composers should have, what would you say would be in your toolbox? Like know how to orchestrate and write like orchestral pieces, but that can be like a lot of different styles.
Mhm.
So what would you put in the toolbox of like these are the must-have?
Yeah, I mean, I think being able to show that you can compose in different game game aesthetics, like really broad, like horror to, an indie title, maybe it's horror, but all the different like fantasy, showing that you can do all these different styles of game is something that's super useful because, some people are only good at composing, for horror games or for action games or, um, I think that that's a smart thing to do for sure is to say like, okay, what is the most broad thing I can show? And, you know, knock all those out.
Yeah, like what is the opposite of the last game that I worked on?
Yeah, sure. And then,
Uh,
it's also a great challenge too, because like, let's say that you're really good at a few different aesthetics. Working on an aesthetic that you're not familiar with and good at is an amazing practice, and you will learn so much from that, and it makes you a better composer and a better artist. So,
100%. I had a question. I forgot what it was. Now you work in the industry on a big game. I'm sure that a lot of other games would love to work with you. I know that now you're an in-house composer, but probably you're gonna have even more opportunities out in the world. But before you got that opportunity, when you're building yourself up, can you
mhm,
tell us about, let's say, a big mistake that you made that you're like, oh, I can't believe I've done this, but you
mm,
learned from it and you grew.
yeah,
Something that you can share with us.
yeah. I think that being a contractor in general, you are really running your own business. So that means that you're doing more than composing and being responsible and paying your bills. It's talking to people about money. It's when someone asks you your rate, and I actually talk to artists about this all the time. Um, artists like younger artists that are maybe a little more inexperienced, they come up with an abstract number for how much something's going to cost, right? Someone says, "Oh, I really think you're a great composer. I want you to write, music for this whole game. What's your rate?" And their idea is, well, I don't know, I'm not that experienced, so I don't know how much I can charge. And then they start thinking of like, well, I don't know, maybe $1,000, you know. But how does that actually quantify? Like, if you're going to be spending 3 months on this game, right? And you're only getting paid $1,000 total, and you're working on the game 5 days a week. What does that end up being? So that's not the correct rate, right? So I would say that my mistake was not really, um, um, not really quantifying what things should cost. And it's not necessarily that things should be expensive, but it was a realistic of like, this is how much this is going to cost because this is how much time we're going to do. Um, so there's that, which comes down to contracts. Um, Learning about as much about that as you can is really great. I feel like just now I'm comfortable with that sort of thing. Um, so there's that, and really just talking to people with a confidence, but that confidence comes from knowing why this costs that amount of money. You know, it's not just a random number. So those are kind of the mistakes I made. Not writing contracts very well, um, getting so-called screwed, like out of my royalties, that I was the owner of, but was talked out of it because of not having the knowledge, you know. That's something to be very careful about.
Can you talk a little bit more about how you would price things nowadays? Did you have a little bit more understanding of how it works? Like, how would you advise other people to either learn about this or price their own work?
Sure. I mean, it's it's pretty easy to do. I mean, if you have an undergraduate degree, I mean, you can easily charge more than 30 or $40 an hour for your work, right? So when I'm talking to composers about pricing, I always ask them, what's the scope of the project? And if it's something that they're going to be working on for a year, like, okay, you probably can't charge hourly for a year because that's going to be like millions of dollars, and the person's not even going to be able to afford that. It's not in the budget. But so you put a larger price, not larger price, you put a standard price for the project. Now, if the project is going to be a week long and you're going to spend 30 hours, 40 hours, you charge your rate. So it depends on how long the project is. That's kind of how I
But
think
you
of
do
it.
it per hour, right?
If
Like
it's
for,
short, if it's short project, I do it per hour. If it's a long project, I do a set price with a designated amount of hours that I'll spend on it a month, for instance.
and how do you keep yourself on the boundaries of like, I'm only going to work on it on this amount of time? Because creative work, we know that like it can go forever. We can just
Yeah.
spend hours without even noticing it.
hmm I mean, I think that comes with experience of doing it for a while and knowing, yeah, I mean, I'm saying I'm gonna, charge them for 30 hours or 40 hours, but I'm really gonna spend 50 on it. You know, you slowly kind of get better at giving estimations of what the work is. Generally, you say, you get paid a little bit more than what you're working just so that it's safe, so that you're not like working way too much and not making the correct wage, you know. And like that really affects the creative work too, because if you're not getting being compensated, or if you don't feel like you're being compensated, you start to feel like, I don't want to do this, or you just kind of pump out whatever and you just give it to them, and you're not really representing yourself well. So it's really within your best interest to make sure that you're comfortable with what your rate is and what you're getting paid.
Another question is like in the early beginning, before you had your first gigs, like how did you even enter to this industry? It's a very small industry. There is a lot of sound designers. Um,
Yeah. I mean, that really comes down to the relationships with your contacts. And the beautiful part about that is that, like, as a musician, or whatever, artist or painter or anything, you can go to live shows and talk to the people at the shows and really network. And you wouldn't like this is why it costs $1,500 to go to GDC, because you're going to go there and you're going to meet 50 people that are really valuable contacts for you. You know, like that's why, same thing, GSC. That's why it's however much money to go to GSC, because, you know, people know that it's really valuable to meet contacts. So I would say, you know, cold call some audio directors and say you're interested in what they're doing and, you like what they're doing, and start building a relationship with them. The ones that you like, the ones that you really respect, that worked on, maybe your favorite games. Maybe they reach out to you, maybe they don't, but you'd be surprised on LinkedIn how many people will reach back to you saying, "Oh, thanks, I appreciate it." So building relationships is ultimately what I think gets you into anything. At least for me, in my chamber music world, that's exactly what it is. Like, all the people that commission me are all people I've worked with or I know, or I have friendships with. So,
that's incredible.
yeah.
This is, I would say, one of the most useful advice through this through this talk, which is like just network and talk to people because you never know where you're going to find opportunities.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah, and I would say like there's also a way to do that because I'm sure that there's the folks out there that are really just trying to snatch a job, and I can tell you that people aren't stupid. They pick up on that, and they feel like that is maybe a little bit like um disingenuine. Is that the word? You know? I mean, because ultimately the people that are hiring you, like they they're going to hire you because they want to work with you, not just because you're good at your job. They want to work with you because like, I could sit and brainstorm with this person and actually learn things and it'll make me better. So going to GDC and being like, here's my card, do you have a job for me, call me, like they're just you're going to disappear like the other 1,000 people that did that to them. But the person that comes up to them that's interested in what they're doing, like genuinely interested, and is just interested in building a professional relationship, that's how you network.
Yeah, I have a lot of people that message me and they ask me if I have any audio gigs. And I'm like, well, if I had
Sure.
any, I would take them myself.
Yeah.
Like, I wouldn't, like, and if
Yeah.
it's not a good gig, then I would not transfer it to someone else. Like, if I said no to it, I won't just give it to someone because I don't think it's a good gig. What would be your advice to people who are trying to reach out? Like, what to avoid or what to send? What can get people's attention?
Yeah. I mean, I think I think it's really just that human connection that makes a person interested in what you're doing. It's who you are as a person, who you are as an artist, you know. I'm not saying that you shouldn't care about money and all that stuff. You should care about what's important to you, but I think that when people feel a human connection to someone else, that's I don't know if that's really advice, but I guess my advice is to reach out to people you're genuinely interested in, you know? Like, if that makes sense.
Yeah, like what would you write to a person? Let's say you found a composer and you've been admiring their work for years and you want to reach out. What would you write to them? Like not,
Yeah,
hey, I'm looking for a job, but
yeah. I listened to your score. I really liked what you did. I thought the mix was really great. I thought it was an interesting take on, what you did here versus what people usually do. Um,
that's true. Complimenting on people's work just
yeah,
show that you have an interest in them. Yeah.
yeah. But it's they have to be genuine compliments. So you're not just because you don't want to be an ass kisser either, because then you're just, you know, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you have to actually be passionate and
Yeah.
fascinated by what they did.
Yeah, that's why you reach out to people you're interested in, and like ultimately you don't want to work like as much as people may think that they want a job, like you're not going to want to work with people that you're not interested in, because it's just going to become a job at that point, you know? And ultimately we're doing this sort of thing because we want to be able to do music and whatnot, be artists and make a living from that. But when it becomes a job, then it's a totally different thing, you know?
That is so true. Josh, we're getting towards the end. I would love to open this up to see if there are any questions from the
Sure.
audience. So I'm just gonna look at the chat. And if there's anyone who wants to like jump in and ask Josh a question, that will be a good time. Seeing that Melissa is on our chat checking it. So let's just give it a moment or two. Yeah, Melissa, if you want to come on stage and read them, and yeah,
Hey, Melissa.
we cannot hear you for some
I think you're
reason.
muted.
Yes.
There you
Okay. Yes. So
So
while you're doing that, I'm going to be checking the chat to see if anyone else wants to jump in.
yeah, so I had some questions that people had asked pre-event that I wanted to make sure that we captured as
Sure.
well. So one of them was just generally asking about Tiny Tina's Wonderland specifically. Like, did you have any favorite sounds that you worked on in that particular game, or any other games or experiences that you worked on where you had some like really fun sounds that you worked on?
Yeah. Because I did the music for that. I didn't really do any sound design other than a few little moments that required musical elements within the game. So there was this one that did have a lot of fun with where I was supposed to make the sound of a pipe organ starting up, and I think it was in the one of what is it, the Sea Scarp something, I can't remember, but it was like in one of those maps where you're next to a ship that's sunken in the ocean and there's no water, and you're supposed to start up this this like pipe organ that's made out of skulls and teeth and stuff. And um, yeah, I've recorded a bunch of sounds of like air, and I even used my trumpet for some of those sounds. That was something that I had a lot of fun with. That was different than making music, you know.
Mm.
Yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. We also had a question about, ideas about how you can develop electricity sounds in particular, because those are, you know, they seem like a little bit more difficult sounds to make, perhaps.
Yeah, I don't really know. That would be a question for. I mean, there's definitely methods of how to do that, but really, it's trying to find new ones, you know. So
Mm.
I'm sorry, but I don't really I don't have an answer for that.
I
That's fine.
found for small circuits, what worked for me is taking like a bunch of like little metal pieces. So it could be screws or bolts or anything, like even like little metal plates, dropping them and then using that recording in a DAW and like changing the pitch. So it goes like, and like it kind of create this like metallic sound of like something is happening on the background.
That's pretty smart. See.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. Yeah.
uh,
Another one
yeah,
that
it kind
was,
of create that like tiny sound. Anyway,
oh,
sorry,
yeah.
Melissa, go
Sorry.
for it.
Another question that someone had posted before the event too was just generally asking like how you develop a sound palette for fictional characters, and kind of what you consider when you approach something that's out of this world, so to speak.
Yeah. I generally like to build a instrumentation for that. So, in the old days, there really was no instrumentation for film. It was just we're using an orchestra. That was just the given thing. But now these days, we have access to all different, you know, um, combinations of single or many instruments. And so I try to build a instrumentation palette for a character or for a map or for, a landscape. And that's kind of where I start.
Okay, interesting, awesome.
Yeah, like real quick. So,
Yeah.
um, for for Wonderlands, that for Tiny Tina, I I had in my mind like, okay, I want to like have her being like, I imagined her playing on like a broken like violin
Mm.
as like kind of like a fiddler or something like, and so I got this got this guy, and I
Yeah.
started, and it only has three strings on it. Like, so I literally like found kind of a broken, this is a viola, but I found like a broken viola, and started trying to write themes on it, and I eventually sampled it so that I could actually, play something that sounded good. It didn't sound like me playing the viola, because I'm no violist. But that's kind of where I start. And that's also exciting too, because you're not just bound to a VST of like, well, do I want harp or do I want, this sound, or, so you go on a little search, and, I sort of collect instruments. So it's fun. That's where I start.
Super cool.
Yeah.
Another question now from the chat is it better to be a generalist in terms of framing sounds and music versus fully recording and mixing, or should you specialize in one topic?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's up to you. I mean, if you want to specialize in one topic and do other things generally, that's really good. Um, I'm sure that it's possible to be a so-called god at everything, you know. If that's what you strive to be and strive to do, then I would say go for it. Like, I don't really have any answers of this is better than that. Like, don't do this, do that. I think that really ultimately you're the one that has to decide who you are and become that no matter what. Even if it's a generalist, like, you know what I mean? Be the best damn generalist that there is, you know?
I feel like it always sounds bad when you tell people like, "Oh, I'm an audio generalist." It's like, "Oh, I don't have a profession. I just do whatever." But it's not true. Those people are super valuable, and I wrote this before this meeting that those are the type of people that you can drop them on any project, on any part of the project, and they can just swim and they can carry out the work that is needed without you worrying about like, "Oh no, this is only doing sound design and this guy is only doing the implementation."
Yep.
So it is valuable, even though the term sounds not as fancy as other terms.
I mean, like, you know, not theoretically, but theoretically, I'm a music generalist at Gearbox. Like, you know, so there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, at my company, we call them unicorns,
Oh yeah.
like the unique, because it's so hard to find them. There's like one in a million. You find one unicorn that's like they can do everything.
Well, I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to say I can do everything, but like I am somewhat of a generalist. Someone can come to me and say, "Hey, we need some like club music. Can you do that real quick?"
Yeah.
Or like, "Hey, we need like, something else." I mean,
Or yeah, our VO guy just left. Any chance that you can like implement those sounds? And you're like, oh yeah, sure.
so I
If
don't know. I
needed.
haven't, yeah, I haven't really touched on implementing VO yet, but maybe someday.
Really.
Yeah, I'm
I
only
don't recommend working on that. I tried it once and it's not fun, especially when you have internalization and you have to support
oh
multiple
yeah.
languages.
Our VO
Oh gosh,
team is like they're pretty baller. Like they're pretty on it. They know what they're doing.
that's amazing.
Yeah.
Melissa, do you want to bring more questions from the chat? I also wrote if someone wants to jump on stage, but I'm seeing that no one is picking up on that offer. So let's just keep going through the questions.
There's another one that says, when you have a background in music production, but you want to direct your career to composition and sound design for media, how do you orient your CV? Do you still show detail about music production skills or just reference them shortly? All this experience is only as a student, so in general, I don't have that much of skills to be proven with professional experience just yet.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think that part of that is those are really great technical skills that you have, so you should show those. And like a big part, and a lot of people don't realize this, and even God, I'm date myself, but 20 years ago when I was in college, you know, a lot of composers didn't know how to use a DAW. Like they didn't even have a DAW. They didn't have monitors. They didn't know what VSTs were. Not all of them, but it was pretty general in the academic scene that composers weren't producing their own music. So I think that that is a technical skill that's very valuable that this person has, and they should definitely show how great their mixes are of their own compositions. I mean, that's extremely valuable because a lot these days, composers, they make mock-ups for a piece and then they get it recorded at a studio and the mixing engineer or sound engineer mixes it and produces it. So it's definitely a skill. I don't know if that answers the question. Sorry.
I think it is. So we have Zaid who wants to come up and speak to us. Zaid?
Hey, how's it going, Josh and everybody? Shirley, Melissa, very nice to see you guys and hear from you. Quick question just about submissions for music. So I've done production, like just music production as a music artist and just released for like a couple of years, like 6 years, and just done releases. And before Cyberpunk came out, I had an album that I wrote and that I produced and was releasing. And I wanted to submit to it. And so I don't really know what the formal process was. So I just emailed a couple of songs that I thought would really like fit the album or fit the game. Obviously, needless to say, I didn't get a response. What's like the temperature for getting placed in like a game and stuff, and like knowing like you are doing things yourself,
Mhm.
in-house, what's typically like the temperature for you for any kind of game, I guess, for external artists like submitting their music to projects?
Something that's a great question. This is, I would say this is something that is sort of hard to get into if you don't have a couple of titles already. So what something that really helps a lot is actually being with an agency that helps you helps you get placements.
Mhm.
Because as just a single person trying to do all that yourself, you don't have the resources that agencies have. And when I say resources, I don't mean money and stuff like that. I mean like actual contacts. Like agencies are extremely valuable because there's a difference between you submitting that work and then agent X, I don't know, we'll call him agent
Yeah.
X, submitting the work to Cindy, who is the audio director of, whatever
Yeah,
labs.
yeah. Someone who's just pretty much plugged in, like that's
Yeah.
essentially what yeah.
And so like that's something that's really valuable is I would talk to some agencies and see what they require for you to be
Mhm.
in their placements. That's something
Okay.
that's very valuable. And they're very welcoming too, because if you're good at what you do, like they can sell it, so it's good money for them, it's good money for you. Um, there's also, I would mention, there's a lot of great opportunities for real royalties and that sort of thing. Because
Mhm.
if you get placed in a Netflix thing or whatever and it becomes, you know, an icon or whatever, a classic, I mean, you're going to get royalties like that forever. Um,
Mhm.
so I'm sorry, I don't know if that answers your question.
No, no, that's great. I mean, I guess as a follow, do you have any recommendations for agencies? I didn't because I don't really understand exactly like I kind of
Sure.
understand how it works, but I don't like there's just so many, so it's like what do
Yeah.
you
Yeah, yeah. I
you
mean,
know?
generally agencies want to see that you've had a few titles, right? So
Mm,
of anything, like, oh, I made music for Wonderlands, or I had my music, or my sound design was in a Warner Brothers library, right? So
mhm.
they'll see that and be like, okay, this person, we could probably sell their music, right? But
Okay, they think something.
if you don't have any of those things yet, and they don't have to be huge, but that's what I
Mm,
would do first before really like approaching any agencies, because um,
mhm,
I know that doesn't answer your question, but what you could do is you could reach out to people on LinkedIn who
mhm.
are famous, not famous, but um, famous composers in the scene, and ask them what agency they're under, or just look up your favorite, artists and see what their agency is and go from there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
That's actually yeah, that's probably a better answer anyway. Okay, cool. Yeah, no,
cool.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We have another question in the chat that I can read out too. So, in the creative process, when you do different roles simultaneously, do you personally find it empowering to have the power to jump from integration back to source designing to quickly fix arising problems? Or mostly you ideally would like to focus on a certain stage of production at the time and not just lose focus jumping between technical and creative aspects of the production?
Yeah. I would say that this is why what is called a pipeline. Pipeline is, if for those that don't know, is the way that things move through and get done and are established, right? So if that pipeline is really great, you don't have to go back and fix things. You know what I mean? So, and obviously you're always going to have to go back a little bit and fix things, but if you have to go back way a lot and then fix things, so that's one part of the balance. The other thing is, it is very empowering to be able to have, I wouldn't say power, but control to be like, I don't like what the violins did there. I need to put an EQ on that, or I need to take the basses out completely, and just go into your session and do it, rather than say, hey John, when do you have time to take out those basses, and can you put an EQ? Like, yeah, sure, I'll have it in 4 days. Is that cool? Like, there is a lot of empowerment in being able to control what's in there, right? And being a jack of all trades, um, you know, it's just much easier and more efficient to get things done, as I like to get things done. I don't like to wait. So
I have a following question to this one, but do you feel like you need to put like different hats, meaning like the creative hat of like actually coming up with new themes versus like the technical hat of like, okay, now I just need to get that in. And it's a very technical mindset.
yeah, I mean, sometimes at the end of the process, you're like, you know what, like I can't think about this creatively anymore because it's not helping and it's just putting us in a corner. So sometimes you just have to make that decision of like, yeah, this is what it's going to be, or we're out of time, and then this is what it is. So
I actually have a question personally because I'm not a audio professional, but I'm here in this Discord because I'm trying to learn more about it. I usually work in like emerging tech, XR type of space, and so sometimes I work on projects where obviously there is audio involved, but it's not always the focus, which can happen for sure. And I'm just wondering, as someone who might be sometimes in more of a like AV capacity, like how I could work with audio teams more effectively. Especially because, for example, when I do projection mapping projects outdoors, where like they mix their tracks in the studio, and then once it's actually played, it's bouncing around all these buildings downtown, and it sounds completely different. And like I'm given one track that I'm trying to like maybe the only control I have is to like adjust the volume. So if there's like some booming bass, maybe I'll just like tween it down a little bit to try to adjust it. But sometimes I get into those situations. So I'm curious how, like, as someone who's in more, audio and music side of the team, like how I could work better with people like yourself.
for sure. Yeah, I mean, this reminds me of when I'm being commissioned to write music for chamber musicians. So I always ask them, what's the venue going to be like? Or is there going to be a sound system? Uh, are the speakers large or are they small? How big is the room? You know, what kind of piece do you have in mind, right? Because let's say someone's like, hey, I want you to write me I don't know, a piece for, I'm trying to think of something ridiculous, harmonica, okay? And you're like, okay, cool. And then you write this piece without any of that information, and then you find out they're playing it in a football field with like no amplification, right? I know this is a ridiculous thing, but being as communicative as possible about what you're going to be doing and what's going to be happening, I think is useful for that situation, you know.
I think it happens a lot on mobile phones and XR devices because like people don't appreciate how small those speakers are and how like all the sound need to come from like a really narrow band. So
Yep.
they put a lot of basses and you can't hear anything, or they put a lot of like, yeah.
Yeah, and there's nothing more like unsatisfying than building this beautiful thing in your studio and then you're finding out that it's like just not going to be represented. It's really painful, you know.
Exactly.
It's almost like
Exactly. This
teams
is a
meeting.
great tip. Always test your sounds on the medium that you're going to be delivering with, and
Yeah,
not just with your fancy computer monitors.
right. Oh yeah.
Well, I see that there are no more questions. Josh, thank you so much for your time. I'm sure that you're going to stay on the server and be able to answer more questions if they
Sure.
come up. And we're going to try to post some of the resources that we talked about during this discussion. Um, yeah. Thank you. I'm seeing that people are right now coming in and asking questions. So like we'll give them another few minutes. No, just thank yous. So thank you so much, Josh. We'll see you on the server if anyone have more questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to meet you both, and thank you for having me.
Of course.
Thank you for
All
being
right.
here.
My pleasure.
I'm
Yeah,
gonna finish it here.